Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Vlandas. I'm a fellow here at the European Studies Center. It's my great pleasure today to be chairing this panel on a recently published book that's already been presented in several places in Europe, from what I understand. The book is this one, Welfare Chauvinism in Europe, and the author is Dr. Gianna Eick, who's an assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam in European politics and comparative politics. Gianna has a PhD in social policy at the University of Kent, so not very far from here, and then did a postdoc at the University of Constance, which has a very prominent also cluster on inequality that you may have encountered before. And to discuss this work, which is really the kind of continuation of earlier work that Gianna has been publishing at the intersection of social policy and political science, and at the intersection of migration and welfare state studies, we have Dr. William Allen, who is our very own postdoctoral British Academy fellow in DPIR and Department of Politics and International Relations and Compass, and who's also published quite a lot of work on public opinion, on migration, and more broadly in comparative political science. So the proceedings today will be as follows. Gianna will talk for about 30 minutes, and then Will will offer some comments for a maximum of 10 minutes, and then you will all have an opportunity to offer your thoughts and ask questions, and hopefully we'll have a lively discussion. So without further ado, Gianna, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the kind introduction, Tim. Okay, I hope I speak loud enough for you. Yes, so thank you so much, everyone, for coming to my book talk about my book, Welfare Chauvinism in Europe. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here to present it. And let's start. So I will start a little bit more generally about what kind of research I'm doing, and also everything that's related to my book. So the topic of welfare state recalibration, and in my mind that connects three different wheels that are turning. So the recipients, which recipients get access to the welfare state, the policies, which kind of policies does the welfare state cover, invest in, and the government's level that is responsible for the welfare state administration and also finance. And yes, if we look at it from a more historical perspective, the welfare state has been growing enormously over the past decades, especially in a lot of European and Western democracies. And at the same time, there's also an opposition that is rising. And in a recent work of mine, me and the co-author called this welfare policy opposition, which we see as an umbrella term covering different forms of protest towards existing or future welfare policies provided by different governments levels and social partners. And yeah, actually we just published a special issue on this topic. So if you're interested in welfare policy position and different paradigms, so we cover welfare populism, welfare chauvinism, and welfare Euroscepticism, which I will also briefly mention later. I recommend having a look. And of course, I will talk about welfare chauvinism, which I think is at the heart of current political conflicts. And what is welfare chauvinism? So welfare chauvinism is this opposition to welfare access, welfare rights, to migrants and refugees and newcomers in general, also minorities, basically welfare for us versus them. And it's often related to these ideas that people are coming into the country to take away the benefits that newcomers are jumping the queue to get support from the government, and especially that the newcomers are the burden on the welfare state and on the taxpayer. And welfare chauvinism has been a winning formula, and nowadays we see it in the many elections. That is one of the main topics actually, even though it's not always called like it. But we see a lot of political discourse around welfare chauvinism. And especially now, I showed the example of Vlandas in the Netherlands. It's a very silent issue. And yes, speaking of silent issues, it's also a topic that is really politicized, and we can even see it with the example of my book that has already been politicized in the Netherlands. So I gave a quite long interview for one of the biggest Dutch newspapers. And then a columnist from the biggest newspaper, daily newspaper in the Netherlands, the Telegraaf, decided to directly comment on this interview and on my person to undermine the argument. And now I was interviewed by another big newspaper also about the same topic. So it's very apparent to me that it's a topic that people really want to talk about and hear about, and that's very politicized. Yes, and welfare chauvinism more generally can appear in parties, or at least that's where we have a lot of research about, in parties, policies, and publics. So in parties, here are some examples, for example, from Germany, where the leader of the mainstream right, or CDU, accused the Ukrainian refugees of coming to Germany simply to apply for benefits in Germany, for such benefits, social assistance. And then we have also examples from the right in Belgium that criticizes the UN migration impact because then newcomers could get more social rights. And examples in policies are, for example, the child benefit affair in the Netherlands, which was about benefit fraud, and where the administration particularly targeted recipients who have a so-called foreign sounding name. So that was a big scandal in the Netherlands. And now actually in Germany, there's also a new policy introduced that gives the refugees only access to their cash benefit social assistance support through a specific bank card, which is not, it doesn't work like a normal bank card, but it has a lot of restrictions, so it can be more controlled how the refugees use this government money. And finally, public. So here I show an example of the Brexit, which is one of my favorite Brexit welfare chauvinism example. Of course, the whole campaign was really fueled by these welfare chauvinist ideas and convinced a lot of voters, even though not always undermined by facts. And now, of course, we can see it everywhere in the elections. It's a really big topic, not always directly maybe, but often I think general anti-immigrant, anti-refugee policies are also a Trojan horse for welfare chauvinism. And this is the framework of my book. So in the book, I summarize some of the main literature about the topic, but then I dive especially deeper into the public opinion, so public welfare chauvinism. And the way I analyze it is that I look at welfare chauvinism across countries, time, and different policies. And then I look at the how education affects welfare chauvinism, because we have this long-standing argument in the political science or social science that higher levels of education are related to higher levels of tolerance. And I critically examine this argument. and argue that there's also a country level national context, so especially economic and cultural context that influence both welfare chauvinism, but also the relationship between education and welfare chauvinism. So this framework basically aims to go beyond the usual arguments and be a little bit more critical about the current findings that we have. And okay, so I'm going to show some statistics from the book. This is a very commonly used question to analyze welfare chauvinism. And the question is like this. So the respondents hear the question, thinking of people coming to live in, for example, the UK, a specific country from other countries, when do you think they should obtain the same rights to social benefits and services as citizens already living here? So immediately on arrival is the least popular answer. Then after a year, whether or not they have worked. Then the most popular answer is after work and pay taxes at least a year, so on the reciprocity principle. And then in red, I highlighted the two answer categories that in the book, at least, I see as welfare chauvinism or extreme welfare chauvinism, because they're not anymore based on the typical British reciprocity idea of the welfare state. So once they've become a citizen, or they should never get the same rights. And overall, this answer makes up around 40% of the European public. So this is data from almost 40,000 Europeans from the representative survey, the European Social Survey. And let's have a look at that across different countries. So here I highlighted the average, the Netherlands and the UK. And as you can see, the levels across countries vary a lot when it comes to welfare chauvinism. The highest levels we can see in Eastern European countries, but then also immediately followed by the Netherlands, which is not a surprise looking at what happens now in the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands, it's already over half of the people that say migrants should only get or newcomers should only get access to social benefits and services once they've become a citizen or never at all. And then in the UK, the level is actually below average, around 30%, but 30% is still a lot. 1, 2, 3, that's still a lot. And as I mentioned, I also look at welfare chauvinism across time, and here we can also see significant differences in how the publics developed over the last decades when it comes to welfare chauvinism. So on average, there is a small decline of about 3%. And then we have some countries where there's more decline, for example, in the UK, around 12%. And maybe I should mention that the latest data in the UK was collected after the Brexit referendum. But then in other countries like the Netherlands again, welfare chauvinism is actually increasing. So that's also important to keep in mind. Basically, that there's more and more polarization when it comes to welfare chauvinism. And as I mentioned before, I also look at welfare chauvinism across different policies, because one of the biggest research gaps that I see is that most of the public welfare chauvinism research looks either at the welfare state in general, which of course can sound quite threatening to say, okay, the migrants and refugees get access to the whole welfare state. Or studies look at cash benefits or compensatory policies like social assistance, unemployment benefits, and child benefits. And we can assume that the public is much more critical when it comes to these cash benefits because they can be, for example, transferred across borders. and there's less control over what people do with them. But in comparison, in-kind services or also social investment policies have more the aim of integrating people into the labor markets and also into societies. So here we can assume that the public is much more open, but it hasn't analyzed before. Other than now, as you can see in the book, that it's in fact the case that the public welfare chauvinism levels are higher when it comes to these cash benefits than when it comes to services. And actually, the most of the opposition we can see when it comes to EU-wide child benefits. So here, by large, the opposition is the biggest. And here, the same question was asked, and in the ESS, but specifically directed at Eastern European workers. And the study was conducted in the UK, in Denmark, and in Germany. And by popular demand, I also included a slide on different voting groups, which is not from the book, but from some work that I already did before with Christian Eick Larsen. And basically, what we can see, maybe it's a little small, but I can tell you that we see the same kind of differentiations across different voting groups. So no matter who you're voting for, you always prefer the services for the newcomers than the cash benefits. And that's more or less quite steady. So obviously, people who vote for the radical right or making right have generally higher levels of welfare chauvinism than the left. But we can still see that the services across the board are more popular in the public. So that's a very important finding, I think. And then, of course, the book also deals with this education effect. So I also want to talk about that briefly, and we can discuss a little bit more about it later. So the question is welfare chauvinism only a phenomenon across lower educated group? Because when we look again at the newspapers and at the media discussions, it's often the case that this effect is really simplified. So then the lower educated are getting blamed for Brexit, for radical right parties winning, for anti-immigrant attitudes in the public. And here the example is also again about Vlandas, support for Vlandas, where it was said in the Financial Times that education is the biggest predictor of support for Vlandas. Yes. But when we now look at welfare chauvinism, it's a little bit more complex phenomenon because on the one hand, it's an anti-immigrant attitude, but then it's also about welfare. And now we have different mechanisms happening because welfare in general, and we'll talk about it later a little bit more, is more supported in general, and my other publications also show that by lower educated people, because the higher educated people are usually the group that is less dependent on the welfare state, particularly on cash benefits. And at the same time, it's usually also the group that is paying more taxes into the system, so maybe loses more. And when we look at welfare chauvinism, we can also see that my book nuances previous findings. So maybe on average, yes, the higher educated are a little bit less welfare chauvinist, around 7%. But then these education gaps also vary across countries again. For example, in Russia, it's actually the higher educated, so here tertiary educated, that's where we can see higher levels of welfare chauvinism. In the Netherlands, it's almost the same across the groups. And in the UK, we can actually see quite a large gap between the higher and lower educated. And I think that's also in line with other findings that the education gaps in the UK are actually really significant. But still, there's also a lot of welfare chauvinism amongst the higher educated. That should also not be forgotten. So it's still, I think, on average, more than every third person who has a tertiary education degree, and that's still a very lot. It's a lot. So we should not underestimate it and just simplify. Okay, one group has these exclusive attitudes, and the other group is so inclusive. That's also not really helpful. I think keeping in mind the current discourses that we have. I will just summarize now the main findings when it comes to education and how this relationship between education and welfare chauvinism is shaped by different contexts. So across countries, time, and social policies, higher education does not automatically relate to lower levels of welfare chauvinism. The education effect can disappear in national contexts with precarious economies and right-wing cultures. And so these findings show that migration and lower levels of education are not the root of all problems. And I argue that we should shift our focus to institutions and those who shape them to understand the growing polarization and inequality in society. And then this is another example that I also mentioned at the end of the book, because one of the biggest developments we have maybe now regarding welfare state recalibration is that the European Union is also spending a lot of budget on harmonizing social policies across the EU and also on specific financial instruments. And here we can see, when we look again at the education gaps, that it's actually here the higher educated that are on average more against common EU social policies. And here in this example, we see a question on an EU-wide minimum income scheme. So that's something we really have to keep in mind when we look at these education effects, that it's not generally the case that one group is more supportive of the welfare state than others. So we need much more nuanced research on this, especially when we look at education. And I also just published a special issue on social Europe and this opposition to social Europe that we said before. I call it welfare Euroscepticism. So yeah, that you can also look up if you're interested in that. I think it's especially timely now with the upcoming EU Parliament elections. And yes, as an outlook, I think it's really visible from the data that welfare chauvinism is becoming increasingly normalized in certain countries, in particular this cash benefit chauvinism, and that we can see particularly scapegoating of migrants in times of economic crisis and right-wing mobilization. And from what I find in the book, more investment in social services could be a way forward, could actually address a lot of the different challenges. So, for example, one of the issues with welfare chauvinism is also that the public has really wrong perceptions. On the one side, on the number of migrants and refugees, so usually people much overestimate how many refugees are coming into the country. And then there is also a misconception about how much newcomers are costing. And actually, when we see studies, they're usually showing that migration has no effect on the welfare state. Basically, some groups cost more money and other groups give more money, contribute more money. So let's just think about a school child, which of course costs some money because they are receiving this education, versus a doctor who's paying taxes. And yeah, now we also have some studies that actually show that the citizens are more expensive to the, to the governments than the newcomers. And yeah, so that I think that there needs to be much more education on this. We also know from the literature that positive contact experiences can influence attitudes towards migrants, or more positive experiences with migrants, also related to lower negative attitudes towards these groups. And in general, of course, so not only education, but also other social services help much when it comes to the well-being of people and feeling part of the society and participating in the labor market. But the problem also with the social services is often that they are very exclusive, not only for migrants. So actually, even though the public, apparently what I show in my book, is wants more access, or at least it's not so much against access for migrants into social services, it's an area where they are very excluded. So, for example, because of language barriers, a weaker social net, or not weaker, but different social networks, discrimination, and but social services are also in general more exclusive of people from lower socioeconomic status groups. Let's just think about another example, tertiary education. So usually we have these issues with educational mobility. So people who already have parents from with a university degree also more likely to get a university degree, and there are different mechanisms of course in place, and they apply both to natives as well as migrants. So yes, and actually the European Union with its own social policy initiatives has a strong focus on services and social investment. So that could be maybe another way forward when we look at this welfare state recalibration topic. But the EU has also quite harsh migration policies. So then it's also a question for the European Union and their social policies about which recipients they want to include and how inclusive they want to be. And yes, with this I finish my part.
Great, thank you. For great and extremely concise summary, which gives us plenty of time now for Win to offer some comments and questions, and then we'll open up for wider discussion. So,
yeah, no, fantastic. And I'm really pleased to be able to serve as a respondent discussant for this book, partly for those folks who haven't had a chance to read it yet. And just as a quick highlight to say that I think, having followed your work for a while in this field, and we've gotten a taste of it already, I feel like this book was a really nice, not only obviously there's new work with it, but I think it's a really nice way to kind of, as a representation and consolidation of the work you've been doing in this space, both in terms of attitudes and the drivers of welfare preferences across Europe, but also thinking about, and you were hinting at this in your talk, right? Different kinds of mechanisms that might be like this. So as a way to kind of, as I was reading this, think about kind of where this sits among, which is obviously a massive kind of body of literature on welfarism and the drivers of attitudes. What really struck to me is a real value added of this book, I think. And you say this right at the front end of it, is how this is a really data-driven kind of look at these patterns comparatively, which I think is really useful for a few reasons. And I think it goes well beyond just description, which I think is also important in its own right. But I think what you do really nicely in your kind of overview slide touched on this, is trying to get this interplay between, on the one hand, macro policy, institutional factors, and how that matters on for individual level kinds of drivers, like you focus on education. I'll come back to that in a moment. But what I wanted to just say at the outset for those folks who haven't read it, it might be interested in this, and that I think a real value added of this is that it acknowledges and really tries to get at that relationship between, for example, parties, policies, and individual level kinds of drivers, right? And publics, as you say. So I think that's a really it's a tricky empirical question, as you acknowledge, right? Causality is very hard to get at that. But I think it's a worthwhile kind of problem that lots of people have been trying to address in different ways, using different forms of data, but which your book kind of in a comprehensive yet comprehensible kind of way sheds new light on these relationships using the best available data we've got, right? We can do comparatively. So I can definitely see this, and I've already kind of pointed my own students and colleagues towards this who are working on this, because I think, like I said, I see this as a really useful resource for folks trying to get their heads around what is ultimately a very complicated set of relationships here. And the other thing I wanted to say as kind of I think a value added to this is that by bringing all that data in, I think it offers a really useful diagnostic tool for the kinds of patterns that we're seeing right across Europe, both at the individual kind of, we'll talk about this in a moment, but the kind of national politics, but also Europe-wide across the EU and perhaps even globally. I'm not sure where your work is going next, but maybe we can there's some hints of that going forward. But yeah, so just as kind of the 30-second pitch, as someone who's read it, and for folks who might be interested in this, I think it is a really comprehensive and comprehensible resource for anyone working on these questions of dynamics, what drives preferences for who gets access to welfare states and different types of welfare. I think you do that really nicely of distinguishing, and also why, right? And these are clearly consequential politically, electorally, but I mean, that leads me to my first question. What struck me when I was reading it, and the way you framed this right in the introduction, that comes right through the whole set of studies, right, is that you initially framed this around the notion of crisis, that we should care about this because look at what's happened, not only due to COVID, but also issues around forced migration inflows due to conflict, but also climate change, right? These different kinds of overlapping crises has made welfare and who gets access to the welfare state much more salient. But I understand it as a framing as kind of the motivation for why we should care now, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on, do you see this issue as being one of change, of responding to crises, or one of actual, perhaps, an understandable continuation, right? Continuity across what we've seen in European politics in a more longer standing way. So is this a story about welfare chauvinism, the drivers, and we'll come back to those drivers you proposed. Is this a story of continuity, one more of change in your mind? Maybe start with that, and then we can go back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for all the kind words about the book. It's really touching to hear all of that. And also thank you for this first question. Yeah, I think it's really good to think about it. So, yeah, I mean, nowadays we can motivate all sorts of work-related and migration-related research topics to different crises. And what I think particularly applies to this welfare state recalibration that I mentioned at the beginning. So, of course, this type of crisis really are a motivator for different political actors to act or think on, okay, how should the welfare state be structured and for whom, and yeah, and who should take care of it. And we can also see this in empirical work that often, for example, attitudes towards governmental institutions, or the government should receive more money, really skyrocket when there's a crisis. But then afterwards they go back to normal levels. And in politics we see the same. For example, everything that was suddenly possible during the COVID-19 crisis. So suddenly a lot of resources are used. So yeah, I think in general it's important to discuss this type of topics, especially in these crisis moments. And nowadays it feels like we're constant crisis, basically. But also in times of crisis, people are often looking out for a strong hand, which in politics can often translate to some more authoritarian leadership because people feel like they're left alone. And so this can further motivate maybe the support for the radical rights. And of course, the migrants are such an easy scapegoat, and the refugees to say, okay, where do we need to make some cuts, or how can we, as the natives, benefit more? And then we can see this also how this thing that often implemented in the policies. But in general, I think we don't have enough data on welfare chauvinism to specifically say, and have results about, okay, how does this political crisis affect welfare chauvinism? In the book, in the title of the book, the data, several crises are covered. So, for example, the economic crisis 2008 and the so-called refugee crisis around 2016. But of course, also in that time, a lot of other things happened. So maybe people have gotten into more contact with migrants and heard some of the more human stories. So we cannot really say what caused what. But one of the surprising findings was that actually the data that was collected just after the refugee crisis did not show overall a significant increase in welfare chauvinism. So actually what I showed you is that the opposite was the case. On average, the attitudes become more inclusive. So yeah, we definitely need more research on that. And the application languages, by the way, they have also not changed across time. So it's not that nowadays, so that's I think what we can sometimes perceive from public discourse and political discourse, that it's not the case that now the higher education have become more tolerant in comparison to the lower educated. So it's again also, I mean, on average, there's no effect, no significant effect at least statistically. And then we can again see that there are some differences across countries. So there are some countries in which the lower educated have become more inclusive, and the higher educated have become more exclusive. So then they're actually the main driver for increase in the welfare chauvinism. So that's also possible in some cases.
So given those patterns, and first of all, I think that you're doing a really good job in terms of trying to bring some data, right, to these kinds of questions which you're asked. I think it's really lacking. But in the book, kind of the overarching argument really lands on some possible levers that might be available to legislators or to policymakers in terms of what might change these kinds of habits, right? On the one hand, it might be something about education, although maybe what you've just described puts some cautionary guardrails on education as one way of doing that. And it might be something about economic policy, the kind of economic policies that are available and might make some forms of welfare more accessible or less accessible, and to whom, right? Whether we're talking about different types of migrants, the data you showed suggests that, whether that's for a certain amount of time or indeed never, or upon naturalization, I guess. Or is it something about, if I interpret kind of where you land overall, it seems like there's this broader set of almost like social and cultural interventions that might also matter here. And you kind of hinted at it both now in the presentation on something around contact, something around interaction. So which of those do you think is the more compelling, or if you had to speculate based on your research and the kind of conclusions, would be the more effective kind of lever to think about what would be the most effective at changing these patterns of welfare children?
Okay, thank you again for another round of comments. Yes, I mean, that's a really tough question that I think is impossible to answer from me at this point. But I think all of these issues matter. So that's why I already said in talk that I think more investment in high quality and inclusive social services could be a really good solution. And of course, that also includes education. So of course, education is key, as you also know, when you work on, I think it's what migrants, knowledge about migration can really matter. And we can see now that there are so many misperceptions about migration. And of course, more education doesn't have to only come via the education system. So, I mean, not in all university degrees, students can take courses about migration, for example. But education can also come from different sources, like the example that I mentioned about the that newspapers are now actually talking about the worker chauvinism. So that can already be something meaningful that also comes from different political actors. But it can also be via the contact that I mentioned. Yes, so that people get more experience. It's because what we of course see is a lot of dehumanization when it comes to migration and particularly refugees, I think. And maybe something else I can also mention here is about how education gets treated by the mainstream and especially radical right, because as you may be aware, there are a lot of attacks on especially higher education by the radical right, and part of this narrative is also this idea that everyone at the university is so left, which I think is also important to show now, and it's not like that. And then also, for example, now we can also see it in the new coalition agreement in the Netherlands, which is also the new government made of the radical right and the mainstream right parties, aiming to fund higher education less, limit student migration, so the income of students from abroad. And then in other countries, we can also see that the governments are tackling specific topics that are taught in education. So, for example, critical race studies. And so we can also see that this education seems to be a really sensitive topic also for the right. And that's really interesting, I think. Yes.
That's just a further question.
Yeah.
And then we take some questions from the audience as well.
Yeah.
And then go back.
No, actually, I think,
Please, go question.
no, I think my third and last question, actually, before we open it up, is actually building exactly on that, right? You're talking about the politicization, how parties are moving on this, and I wondered if you were to be advising, say, no, I mean, it's not like we have anything important happening in this country in the next 6 weeks or so, in a general election, but if you're advising, say, I don't know, a future, that's I think many people anticipate a future Labour government here in the UK, but thinking more broadly across Europe, you mentioned the European parliamentary elections as well. You know, what would you, like, how, I guess, yeah, how would you be advising parties in terms of how they should be thinking about welfare and the way that it is being politicized as an electoral issue? I guess both diagnostic as well as diagnosing what's happening. You mentioned the Netherlands as well, but also prospectively. Where are the cleavages of welfare chauvinism in the year of elections, as it were, 2024?
Yeah, okay, another great question and very important, of course. Why I would say these elections that we have nowadays are definitely elections of welfare chauvinism, because especially from the right, of course, it's really one of the winning formulas for these parties, and it's brought up so much, as I mentioned before, directly or indirectly. And it's really tricky to say again, to say where it comes from. So I think, for example, in the Netherlands, I have not done specifically research on that, but it looks like, okay, maybe it's more of a cultural issue, because the Netherlands are one of the strongest economies, have one of the lowest levels of unemployment. The migrants, for example, are often these immigration policies aim to attract highly skilled migrants that wouldn't be a burden anyways. And the welfare state is not in comparison to other European countries one of the most generous ones, and not one of the most universal ones. So then, by default, maybe what could be the other option out there, and politicians like Vlandas who have been, so to say, educating the public for decades about, yeah, supposedly how bad of an influence the migrants have and refugees have, and yeah, finally this has come to fruition. And then in the UK, for example, I would say maybe there are more economic reasons because this is a more diverse country from the get-go. And then a lot of the discourses that I've seen are maybe more about economy. And then we actually saw that once the public realized more, okay, maybe migration wasn't the problem, then also the voters changed their mind. So at least that's what I think mentioned. So it's really difficult to say, okay, there's this one solution, but in general, I'm wondering a little bit, okay, maybe welfare chauvinism is a winning formula, but is it a sustainable formula for governments? Because I would say to governments that they should focus more on creating societies that are based on solidarity, that really invest in people, for example, just covering basic needs, like having some kind of income or finances. Yeah, they can cover their basic needs in housing. Of course, it's also really beneficial, especially in the Netherlands and the UK. So to focus more on that, because in the end, maybe the governments can introduce a lot of welfare chauvinists and anti-immigrant policies, but then the people will still think, okay, but what did they do for us? And I think in the end, that matters more, should matter more.
Thank you. A round of applause to the discussant.